On this Thursday night, Ontario's Premier doubles down on the Greenbelt. Doug Ford protects his housing minister, but not the protected land at issue.
We're going to build homes until people have the same opportunity that you have.
Idalia careens into the Carolinas. The damage there as Florida surveys its devastation, planning a defiant return despite an evacuation order.
The resident was like, let me in or else.
The convoy heading to Yellowknife's fire zone, one of South Africa's deadliest fires, the desperate escapes, and why so many people couldn't flee the flames. Plus, acing it. The world record spiked at this volleyball game.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Farah Nasser.
Good evening to you, and thanks for joining us. Ontario Premier Doug Ford is digging his heels into the Greenbelt, even though he's facing harsh criticism for using it to build more homes in the province. He's also standing by his embattled housing minister, Steve Clark, after a report from the province's Integrity Commissioner found his government's removal of protected lands was hasty and deceptive.
I'm responsible for everything that happens in the province, and I always make sure we hold our caucus and our ministers accountable to follow the mandate that we gave them.
Both Ford and Clark have denied any wrongdoing, but they do admit the process to select the lands which favored certain developers was flawed. Now, despite calls from opposition and Indigenous leaders for Clark to resign, Ford says he will remain part of his team. Eric Sorensen reports on the fallout.
The tranquility of Ontario's Greenbelt has become intensely turbulent for the Ontario government. Plans to build housing in what was protected green space has mired Premier Doug Ford and his housing minister Steve Clark in controversy.
I'm going to have confidence in Mr. Clark, and I have confidence in my other ministers.
His confidence unshaken after the Integrity Commissioner found Clark failed to have proper oversight over decisions to develop the land. And that was after this.
The housing minister ought to have known the key details.
The Auditor General found certain developers influenced the government to open up the Greenbelt. The housing minister's chief of staff resigned over that. But Ford is not backing down.
I have a message to all the developers. Get the shovels in the ground, get started.
The Greenbelt forms a horseshoe around the Greater Toronto area.
It is here in this part of the Greenbelt northeast of Toronto that the controversy is centered. Duffin's Rouge Agricultural Preserve is 4,700 acres of farmland and natural habitat. As many as 30,000 housing units could be built here. It's a small number in Premier Ford's overall plan to build 1.5 million homes across Ontario, but it would forever change this region.
There's major environmental impacts.
Kim Humphreys lives near the proposed development and opposes Ford.
He does not have to develop on this land. That there's lots of area that can be developed, and this is not the place to be.
The provincial Green Party leader says Ford is favoring developers over what Ontario residents want.
People want housing solutions. They want homes they can afford in communities they want to live in. They want the Premier to put ordinary people ahead of wealthy insiders.
The Premier is not listening to critics.
This Greenbelt, everyone's making such a big deal about. It's a sliver compared to the big problem we have.
The big problem, as Ford sees it, is creating enough housing. So he's going to build, even in the Greenbelt. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Pickering, Ontario.
Premier Doug Ford spent most of his press conference in Toronto today playing defense with reporters. But when Global's Queen's Park correspondent Colin D'Mello questioned him over whether he will hold his own cabinet to account, Ford went on the offense.
What people are seeing here after this Integrity Commissioner and Auditor General's report is nothing but incompetence, right? From the chief of staff who decided to rush through a process, to the housing minister who looked away because he thought it was going to be too politically sensitive, to a premier who directed his housing minister to open up the Greenbelt after promising Ontarians that you would never touch the Greenbelt. But Premier,
okay.
At what point do you take personal responsibility here, and how are people to have trust in your leadership?
Well, thank you for that, Colin, and I'm sure you just walked down the street from your home, that you have a home. But do you know how many people don't have a home, Colin? Well, Colin, guess what? We're going to build homes. We're going to build homes until people have the same opportunity that you have. You have a nice home down the street, but guess what? There's hundreds of thousands of people that don't have your opportunity.
Colin, clearly a lot of frustration in that exchange. Talk to us about the kind of pressure the Premier seems to be under right now.
Well, that exchange, Farah, is emblematic of the fact that Premier Doug Ford is under an immense amount of pressure. The Greenbelt scandal has been sustaining itself for the past 3 weeks. The opposition here at Queen's Park calls Premier Doug Ford corrupt. He's been losing support in public opinion polls. And let's not forget the RCMP is considering whether to launch a full-scale police investigation. All of that led us to today. Housing Minister Steve Clark addressed the media for the first time, saying he takes responsibility but did not tender his resignation. Premier Doug Ford also accepted responsibility, but did not ask for Steve Clark's resignation. It led to growing questions about what the Premier means when he says the buck stops with him. That's when the Premier launched into his attack on journalists, claiming that he was feeling attacked. The Premier later apologized for that exchange. It is all boiling down to this, Farah. Here in Ontario, there is lots of responsibility being taken, but little accountability to go along with it.
Colin D'Mello in Toronto. Thanks for your coverage, Colin.
Thank you.
Idalia ripped across the Carolinas today with very high winds and heavy rain. A near-record tide breached Charleston's historic seawall, and it left many downtown buildings swamped with salt water. In Florida, people are mopping up and they're assessing the damage from the powerful storm that left behind an 1,100-kilometer path of destruction. At least one person was killed in Georgia. President Joe Biden says he's going to visit the Gulf Coast on Saturday to see it all for himself. Jackson Proskow reports on the monster cleanup.
In the Florida town of Horseshoe Beach, the damage stretches in every direction. Residents are returning home to see if there's anything left.
What matters is what I'm holding right here, okay? It's just material stuff.
Hurricane Idalia roared through the town, first with wind, then tremendous storm surge. This was the moment a manufactured home sank under the water. Incredibly, there are still properties left standing.
I'm feeling great. The house is still here.
Up and down an area known as Florida's Big Bend, there's an anxious wait for the waters to recede.
Our house is sitting up under 3-4 foot of water. Overwhelmed, I would say, would be really the only kind of way to describe it. It's just ruined. I mean, everything in there is kind of lost.
Idalia was a storm for the ages, the most powerful hurricane to hit the region in more than a century, tracking across Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Tens of thousands have no power. They face weeks of cleanup ahead.
All the water started coming up through the floor. It wasn't even through the front door, just every corner of the house, just through the floorboards, all throughout the house, the entire house.
Early estimates suggest at least $20 billion in damage, but it's too soon to know for sure.
You did see structural damage to buildings. I saw roofs torn off of businesses. We saw other types of hurricane damage. There's no question.
What is clear is that Idalia could have been far worse, but most residents heeded warnings and left before landfall, a decision that likely saved lives in the face of a powerful storm. Jackson Proskow, Global News.
Officials in the Northwest Territories are placing the reopening of Yellowknife on hold as concerns grow over high winds fueling wildfires near some major highways. More than 240 fires are still burning across the territory, pushing the government to extend its state of emergency until at least September 11th. Several highways remain completely closed, with many others under a road advisory. That means long stretches of road, including the main way in and out of the territorial capital, could close with little or no notice in the coming days. Of course, this pause has added to the growing frustration felt by tens of thousands forced to flee their homes. But officials say it's still too dangerous to return, and they're warning that anyone who tries to could face serious consequences. Jayme Doll reports.
2 weeks hunkered down in campers and on cots in hotel rooms and hostels and convention centers, thousands of kilometers from home. Many evacuees from the Northwest Territory say they've had their fill.
Definitely ready to go home and be in my own house and kind of get some normalcy in our lives again.
The evacuation, it's unfortunate, but I think we're ready to go home.
But the fires that forced them out are still too stubborn, the wind too unpredictable. While the situation has stabilized some in Yellowknife, the territory's one main artery is still in the fire zone.
You're not flying in this It's very difficult to drive in this. There is the likelihood that Highway 1 will be compromised, both in Alberta and in the Northwest Territories, due to fires in the area.
People are getting impatient. On Wednesday, RCMP said it received information a group of about 50 vehicles is planning a convoy back, and that it would not be stopping at checkpoints.
We understand people are frustrated, but this is not the way to deal with that frustration. Everyone's working very hard to get people home, and people will be turned away, and the RCMP are well staffed to address this if needed.
I did receive an email on the weekend that, a resident was like, let me in or else, this convoy is coming. And I'm like, I want to let everybody in. Mother Nature is not cooperating. The highway is on fire. So not sure how the convoy would be looking to charge through. It's definitely unsafe.
RCMP say it will continue to investigate threats of a convoy it believes is in the planning stages.
People are tired. They want to be home. But it's really important that people not try to go home until they're called, until it's time, because not only do you put yourself at risk, you're actually putting our first responders at risk.
The territory's premier is once again urging patience, but it is clearly starting to run thin. Jayme Doll, Global News, Calgary.
The federal government's released a progress report on meeting recommendations made earlier this year by the Rouleau Commission. That's the inquiry that looked into the government's response to the disruptive convoy protests of early 2022 and included whether the use of the Emergencies Act was justified. You'll remember the demonstrations paralyzed the nation's capital and cross-border traffic in multiple provinces. Our chief political correspondent, David Aiken, joins us now. David, what action has the government taken so far?
Well, Farah, you'll remember that Justice Paul Rouleau said the Trudeau government was right to invoke the Emergencies Act, but he flagged plenty of problems with the way police and security agencies dealt with the protests, and he called for better coordination between Ottawa, the provinces, and some municipalities. Now, the federal government released a progress report on its response to Rouleau's recommendations, and 6 months in, the work is still very much at the beginning stages.
Well, it's pretty thin. There isn't much substantive in this report. It just says we're, ongoing. This is ongoing and that is ongoing. Discussions are continuing.
26 of the 57 recommendations Rouleau made had to do with policing reform. The government says the RCMP has started discussions on that, but there's nothing specific yet. Rouleau recommended changes to the Emergencies Act itself, especially tightening up the definition of a national emergency. The government says it is considering such changes. Transport Canada was told develop an inventory of critical trade corridors and emergency management plans. Public Safety Minister Dominic LeBlanc said, well, the work has started. And it goes on. Lots of consultations, lots of discussions, policy papers in the works. The government's final response to the Rouleau Commission, presumably with more details, is due in February. And in the meantime, the criminal trials for two of the convoy leaders, Tamara Leach and Chris Barber, well, those trials begin next week right here in the nation's capital. Farah.
Thanks, David. Police in New Zealand are investigating deaths that could be connected to a Canadian man accused of selling lethal substances to people at risk of self-harm. New Zealand's coroner's court confirmed the deaths are possibly linked to Kenneth Law from Mississauga, Ontario. They didn't disclose how many deaths in that country could be tied to the 57-year-old. In this country, it's alleged Law ran several websites selling sodium nitrite. He was arrested in May, and he faces a total of 14 charges here. Investigators also allege Law sent at least 1,200 packages to more than 40 countries, including the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Remembering lives lost in a crisis. Coming up, how heartbroken Canadians are marking International Overdose Awareness Day.
Want to hear the click before you pull that syringe out.
British Columbians lined up for a free naloxone training event today. It was aimed at teaching hundreds of people how to use the life-saving drug during a possible overdose. The event falls on International Overdose Awareness Day, a day meant to remember those who have lost their lives and been affected by the opioid crisis. Now, although record overdose numbers are seen in several Canadian jurisdictions, per capita, British Columbia remains the hardest hit. Since the province declared a public health emergency in 2016, More than 12,700 lives have been lost to toxic drugs. Between January and July of this year, BC saw 1,455 deaths, the most ever recorded in the first 7 months of a calendar year. As Neetu Garcha reports, advocates say not nearly enough is being done to prevent these deaths.
With locks for their lost loved ones and their images on display at this Vancouver beach.
I lost my eldest son, Jordan. Very sadly, he was given pure fentanyl and he passed away in August 2018, 25 years old.
We need to help people see, no, these people are people like us. They were all worth saving, and they could have been saved.
As BC is on track for its deadliest year for overdose deaths, this is one of several events held across the country for International Overdose Awareness Day.
She left 3 kids behind, 3 sons.
In Toronto, a candlelight vigil, as people in Peterborough pause to remember those who died of toxic drug poisoning.
Let's save lives! Erase no stigma!
And an awareness walk in Halifax. All this comes as First Nations are applauding a U.S. Supreme Court decision to pause and review Purdue Pharma's bankruptcy plan, which would shield the manufacturer of the highly addictive opioid painkiller OxyContin from lawsuits and accountability.
The settlement would have meant that no one else in the world could sue the Shacklers or Purdue or anything. It would have been like done deal. Get out of jail free card, pass. This family is earning $1 million a day in interest off of money they've made off of killing our people.
Joan Jack is a lawyer with the class action lawsuit representing Indigenous communities.
The Supreme Court of the United States has, on their own, requested more information about what's happening with First Nations people in Canada. So it's a huge thing, an amazing moment for us to tell our horrid story, of how we've been exploited.
Jack says renowned author, physician, and addiction expert Dr. Gabor Mate will serve as an expert witness in the case.
I'm hoping that this will bring some peace to some of our families who've lost loved ones.
A pursuit of justice in the face of a crisis that's claiming more and more lives every day. Neetu Garcha, Global News, Vancouver.
Still ahead, anguish in South Africa after a deadly fire. In South Africa's largest city, at least 74 people were killed when a fire engulfed an abandoned apartment building. The Johannesburg building was deemed unfit for living, but it was being used by some of the city's most vulnerable. Crystal Gamansing reports.
Vulnerable migrants, people without homes, and children are among the victims. The grief mounting as officials work to find all of the victims in the 5-story building and identify them. Forensic experts say fingerprints can't be used in many of the cases because the bodies are so badly burnt.
The actual fire escape was closed, so there was a lot of people, a lot of people smoke, people were suffocated, a lot of people died because of the smoke.
Witnesses say some resorted to jumping out of windows, others dropped children down hoping they'd live.
My sister, she lived with the small daughter, and my in-law, she just hit the window and to throw the daughter outside. The people, they just take the daughter on while it was on the air.
The building went up in flames just after 1 a.m. Thursday. It's owned by the city of Johannesburg. It had been a women's shelter, but closed. Politicians say cartels are cramming vulnerable people into derelict buildings and charging rent.
These people who are in these buildings can afford to pay. Yes. Therefore, government must create a stock for rental because that is affordable.
As many as 200 families may have been living in the abandoned building.
I'm still alive, thanks to God.
The cause of the fire is not yet known. Crystal Gamansing, Global News, London.
Next, a man in Nebraska gets pulled over for bucking the law. There was no place like Nebraska last night. The state's university now lays claim to the world record for largest attendance at a women's sporting event. And what a spectacle. 92,003 people crammed into Memorial Stadium for the Cornhuskers volleyball match against rival Omaha. The atmosphere was electric, and it was a 3-set sweep for the home team. The Husker volleyball program holds the NCAA record for consecutive regular season game sellouts at 306. Also in Nebraska, take a look at this. It's not the kind of car horns most people think about. A driver modified his vehicle, removing part of the roof to make room for his bull to ride shotgun. The bull's name is Howdy Doody, and he's a popular attraction at local parades and fairs. Police, though, not amused. They pulled over the duo. Howdy Doody's owner was written up with a warning asking him to take his bovine buddy back home. And that's Global National for this Thursday night. I'm Farah Nasser. Thank you for spending part of your evening with us. We leave you tonight with scenes from around the world of last night's super blue moon, a combination of two rare lunar events. It was a supermoon because it's full during the closest point in its orbit around the Earth, appearing bigger and brighter than a typical full moon, and also a blue moon. That refers to it being the second full moon in a month. Neetha Garcha will be at the anchor desk tomorrow. Have a good night.